you cannot really understand where you are now, let alone where you might be going in the future, unless you understand something about where all this stuff came from and how you got there.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Mittrack, and this week my guest is Paul Feldwick, a veteran of the advertising industry and the author of the books The Anatomy of Humbug and Why Does the Peddler Sing? If you're a fan of this podcast, you will love Paul Feldwick's work. In his books, Paul weaves advertising history together with strategies, frameworks, and models about how advertising works. Our conversation digs into the ideas in these books and covers case studies of Paul's work in the UK advertising industry. We also talk about the tension between more analytical approaches to advertising strategy that are focused on things like segmentation and positioning, and compare those with approaches that see advertising as a form of show business that's more designed to drive fame and popularity. It's a really fascinating conversation throughout, and Paul Feldwick's work has led me to rethink some of my assumptions about the role of marketing. Now, here's my conversation with Paul Feldwick. Paul Feldwick, welcome to A History of Marketing.
Thank you.
I want to just ask, since you spent most of your career in advertising, and then the last decade or two writing about advertising through a historical lens, were you always interested in this history angle of advertising, or did that come later for you?
No, I don't think I always was. When I came into the advertising business, and that was back in 1974, just to put it into some kind of context, I think for the first, 10 or 15 years or so, I just kind of absorbed everything that was going on as if it was like eternal truths, because that's what I think you tend to do at that age. So, all the things that were taken for granted, I just assumed that this is how it is and it couldn't be any other way. I can probably point to one particular book that was a sort of real eye-opener for me that started me questioning all of that. And that was when I picked up a copy of Martin Mayer's book, Madison Avenue, USA, which was as a journalistic study of advertising in America, written and published in, I think, 1955. When I got it, this was probably about 1985 or something like that. So this book, now 30 years old, which still seemed like sort of ancient history, given that most people in advertising weren't very interested in history or thought even 5 years ago was a long time ago. And as I read it, I just found all these light bulbs really going off in my head, because I suddenly realized that all these concepts that I've kind of taken for granted as being, as I say, some kind of eternal truths, were in fact just ideas that particular people had had at particular points in time, and that had just happened to catch on because they were simple, or because they become popular, or because somebody had advocated them in a particularly, effective way. So, when I began to realize that the whole thing about the unique selling proposition was completely invented by a guy called Rosser Reeves, or that advertising recall had been invented by a guy called George Gallup. And, what's more, the more that was when I started to sort of put these things, I think, into a different perspective. And then the more I looked at them and the more I reflected on it and read a bit more about it, it became clear to me that not only were these things sort of contingent and specific in time, but that almost without exception, they had no real solid foundation in terms of science or empirical testing, or even any kind of coherent theory. They were just kind of ideas that people had come up with and gone, hey, how if we did it like this? And then they just caught on as fashion does. So, suddenly advertising recall was easy to measure. And suddenly everybody wanted to measure it because it was, so everybody wanted a number that was bigger than the other guy's number. And nobody was stopping to say, does this number what does this number really mean? Does it actually mean anything? Or why do we believe that every ad has to have a proposition? And then that sort of led me back into where did that come from originally? And I realized that both Reeves and Ogilvy were huge fans of this guy called Claude Hopkins, who, again, none of my contemporaries claim to have even heard of, who wrote his book back in the 1920s. So I kind of dug back into that and thought, well, what did Hopkins have to say? And I found this is fascinating, that Hopkins has a view of advertising and how it should be done, which is completely different from what I'm doing right here, right now in the 1980s. And yet, he seems to have been a huge influence on some very important people. So how do I reconcile these things together? So that kind of led me into just understanding that you cannot really understand where you are now, let alone where you might be going in the future, unless you understand something about where all this stuff came from and how you got there. And then you are in a position to be critical of it. I mean, you don't have to be critical in the sense of saying, well, it's all rubbish. Although
Right.
occasionally it's quite close to being rubbish. But
Right.
you get to a point where you can say, well, this is a useful concept for this kind of situation, and I can see why it became popular. But actually, it doesn't explain this kind of situation, and yet we're kind of acting as if it did. So that was how I got started, I guess. So that was where the historical perspective came in. And it was by no means a case of, oh, isn't the history sort of quite interesting? Although it was interesting. The real fascination for it was it began to explain something about why we're doing what we're doing right now, and put me in a position where I felt that we could take a more, intelligent, critical attitude towards that. And that, I think, has sort of drove me ever since in terms of why I continued to find advertising fascinating over the following decades.
So much of that also rings true for my own interest in marketing history. This idea of the way that I do my job and live my life and my whole organization, team, and industry is structured. It's structured around things like a funnel. And who invented this funnel? Where did this come from? There is no funnel. It's just somebody's idea that sort of caught on
Yeah.
at some point.
And again, it's a useful way of thinking about things sometimes, and yet you can also get completely obsessed by it.
So as you were discovering Madison and sort of historical elements to advertising and looking towards the past, you were 5 to 10 years or so into your career. Did you discover things that made you think, oh, I wish I had found this sooner? Or did it change the way that you yourself advertised or worked with clients or worked with others within your agency? Or how did it sort of inform your own
It's a
practice?
more complicated question to answer. I think it took a long time for me to fully process it, let me put it that
Yeah.
way. Because, of course, I was working in the world as it existed. So while I was beginning to become more I mean, there were always things that we questioned. I was working in an advertising agency, Bose Massimi Pollitt, back in the 70s and 80s. We were known as a very creative agency, and that's as you know, I think that's a highly charged word, which we might come back to
Hmm.
later. But I mean, what we meant by creative was we did advertising that was, for the most part, very, very entertaining, and therefore very popular, and therefore very successful. And we kind of quite profoundly believed that that was the best thing to do. And yet, there was a big disconnect between that approach and almost everything that you read in the sort of accepted texts about how you did advertising, which was all, Russell Reeves' unique selling proposition and Ogilvy saying, oh, don't sing your sales message, selling is a serious business, and going back to Claude Hopkins saying,
Hmm.
nobody ever bought from a clown. So there was always this real tension between what we were doing, what we were knew to be effective or believed to be effective, and having to continually sort of push that against a sort of a tide that came very often via our clients, that somehow that was not what advertising was about, that advertising was about selling and giving people facts and giving people information and persuading them why this product was better than another in a very rational way. And so that this was the ongoing context in which I was trying to make sense of these things.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess it took me a long time to really put all that together in a coherent sort of way. And I guess the reason that I wrote the books
Yeah.
was ultimately just sort of to satisfy myself about how to make sense of that. And so I fully made sense of it, I think, only after I'd left the agency and maybe had a bit more, not just time to reflect, but also a bit more perspective where I could look back on what I'd done.
Two books that I read to prep for this interview that you're mentioning, there was the Anatomy of Humbug, and then
Hmm.
there's Why Does the Peddler Sing? And for listeners of this podcast, they're both excellent. They're enjoyable reads. They're relatively short, but they're very dense in that they pack a lot, but also it doesn't feel like homework. It's a really fun, enjoyable, but also full of strategy. And so we're going to talk about both of them. There's the science element and the advertising as salesmanship sort of element, but then there's more of like advertising as showbiz.
Yeah. Right from about the 1900 onwards, advertising agencies were so keen to show that advertising was a respectable profession, and they wanted to distance themselves totally from the sort of the very earliest generation of brands and advertising, which was very much, the traveling medicine show, the Barnum type presentation. And they literally wanted to disown all that. I mean, in 1910, you've got the trade magazine Printers Inc. refusing to celebrate the centenary of Barnum's birth because they said he stood for everything that was sort of vulgar and disreputable, and appealed to the lowest instincts of the public and all this sort of stuff. They absolutely, hate Barnum. And no, instead, from that point on, the advertising industry wants to present itself as professional. They literally want to be taken seriously like doctors or lawyers. So, and the last thing they want to do, you see, this is the catch-22 in it all, that if you do start from a point of view of saying, actually, advertising has a great deal in common with entertainment, then some clients are going to put two and two together and start saying, well, why the hell don't we just hire some entertainers then? Which in many cases would be a very clever thing to do. And in some cases has indeed been done and has been a very clever thing to do. Um, I mean, you look at the history of advertising, and this isn't in the book, by the way. It might be in the next book if there ever is another book, which I'm not sure there will be. But, if you look at the history of advertising in the 20th century, and you'll find, people like George Lois, very famous names, and you look at what ads they actually did, and you find, well, actually, they didn't do very many actual ads at all. They did some other clever stuff, and they were great at
Mhm.
selling themselves, but they didn't do great ads.
Yeah.
But then you can look at another character who's not mentioned in any of the advertising histories. Stan Freberg, who is very famous, very funny entertainer and comedian in the mid 20th century in the 50s and 60s. Stan Freberg wrote loads of ads. He was a great friend of Howard Gossage, who got him some of the gigs. And Freberg would be brought in by agencies like BBDO when they were absolutely stuck. But it was always a really difficult relationship because, Freberg wanted to do this wild and crazy stuff, which was usually incredibly successful and very entertaining. And a lot of it still stands up today. A lot of it's actually, by modern standards, rather politically incorrect today. But I mean, that's just shows how times have changed. But also how sort of irreverent Freberg was. He was taking the mickey out of things. Um, but, nobody talks about Freberg in the history of advertising. It's like there's this sort of unspoken turf battle that I think's always been going on, which is advertising can only be done by these people who are advertising creatives, advertising experts, and if we allow any, these entertainers in, it's got to be entirely on our own terms so that we can control them. And I mean, that's not the only way of doing it. I mean, a lot of great advertising has been done by people who work in agencies who just happen to think like entertainers, like the great John Webster, who I used to work with. But I think, the advertising industry, to some extent, has dug itself into that hole by insisting that what we do in advertising is different from entertainment. And actually, it's a lot more like entertainment than they are prepared to admit.
That's a really interesting idea. I hope you do write that book. I'd read it. The idea that a lot of the most well-known advertising people of the 20th century didn't even write that many, all that many ads, or also that they didn't always follow their own advice. That the ads that Claude Hopkins' agency ran, sure, they did a lot of direct response ads like what he did, but they also did other types of ads that probably broke a lot of his rules. And I'm sure same goes for Ogilvy and so on.
True. I mean, I make the point in The Anatomy of Humbug, Hopkins, a fascinating character actually, because he wrote his book Scientific Advertising, and it's partly written because he knows what his clients want to hear, and he's saying, it's all about, don't be frivolous. Nobody ever bought from a clown. The more you tell, the more you sell. Give lots of facts about the product. I mean, a lot of context, this works really well, and he knew how to make it work really well. But then if you read his own autobiography about other things that he did, he could work in a completely different mode. I mean, he was hired to promote a brand of suet for making cakes, and instead of doing adverts at all, he got a baker to make the biggest cake in the world and put it in the shop window of the biggest department store in Chicago. And, the police had to be called to control the crowds, and it got on the front page of the newspaper. I mean, it's pure Barnum stunt. So, Hopkins had more than one string to his bow. He understood the show business aspect just as well as he understood. And it's not that one's right and one's wrong. They're both things that can be done well or can be done badly, and they're both things that can achieve results. But probably, particularly as the 20th century moved on, and as media moved more and more beyond, simple text to photography and color printing, and then into radio, and then into television, and then into color television, and now, of course, into the internet and TikTok and whatever else. I think it's progressively moved further and further away from the dominance of sort of text-based, rational facts. So there's still plenty of place for those. It's progressively moved more and more into what advertising does. And this is where, the work of Byron Sharp at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, I think, is hugely important and relevant. It is ultimately probably about creating mental availability as much as anything else. And that is very powerfully done through using entertainment.
So let's talk about The Anatomy of Humbug. And I suppose for listeners, we should probably define what humbug is, because it may not be obvious. It's a book where you almost get to the 10th chapter before you're like, oh, I actually get the title now. So it comes from P.T. Barnum, this figure that the ad industry sort of distanced himself from. And so can you share why you think it starts with P.T. Barnum, and humbug is the word that you sort of anchored to?
You were interested in how I chose the titles of my books, I think. You said it. And I know when I had the idea of calling this after I finished writing the book, and humbug sort of emerged towards the end of the process, actually. That's why it doesn't really come into the end. But I decided to call it The Anatomy of Humbug because I just thought it had it had a ring to it. And also there was something subversive about it, because the idea that advertising should be considered as humbug, there's something sort of disrespectful about that. There's something that's really going to annoy an awful lot of people who work in advertising, who just take it all too bloody seriously. Oh, we're not humbug, it's this whole thing about advertising. And in fact, I mean, a number of people who I respected a great deal sort of gently, or not so gently, tried to persuade me not to use that title. I mean, Jeremy Bullmore said, I'm not sure I will use that title. And Paddy Barwise, professor at the London Business School, who was very kind about the book, he said, one thing I think you really shouldn't do is use that title, so this made me actually more and more inclined to use it, because I thought, well, I quite like to be controversial. And, humbug is essentially, it's a rude word. You remember probably the most famous example of its use, which goes back to the early 19th century, is in Dickens's Christmas Carol.
That's the only use that I was familiar with. Prior to reading this book, I had only heard it from Scrooge.
You need to put that into context to understand what it means. And Scrooge is being asked for a charitable donation because it's Christmas time.
Right.
And Scrooge says, Christmas, bar, humbug. And I think at that time, I mean, it means nonsense. It means it's some kind of a cheat or a fraud. I think you have to understand that at that time, the word humbug probably had the same sort of power that a word like bullshit would have today. It's a rude word. I mean, Scrooge is being memorably dismissive of the whole thing about Christmas. He's saying, Christmas, bullshit, and the same word was, now, if you've seen The Greatest Showman, which is a very unhistorical movie about Barnum, but it does get this sort of quite close to right, that Barnum had a lot of critics, and one of his sort of arch enemies described him as a humbug. And that was meant to be damningly rude, in the same way that Scrooge was being damningly rude. But Barnum, of course, being Barnum, sort of thought he saw how he could turn this to his advantage straight away. So Barnum said, I'm not just a humbug. He said, I am the prince of humbugs. And he gloried in this word humbug. And he then went on at some length and wrote a lot about what he believed humbug really was. And he quite cleverly defined it in a way that sort of meant, yes, of course it's nonsense. Of course it's not literally true. Of course there's an element of make-believe about it all, but it's not actually deceit, because I'm not trying to fool people. I'm not trying to trick people. And he says, humbug is about putting on a show. It's about attracting the crowds. It's about promising people whatever they want, but then make sure they get value for money. So it was in that spirit that he tried to reclaim the word humbug, and he used it and sort of gloried in it all his career. And it was when I read more about Barnum and I started to think about how Barnum, who had been so disowned by the advertising industry, was in fact, in many ways, where so much of what, not just advertising, but the whole phenomenon of brands as we know them, derives from the activities of Barnum, that I started thinking, actually, in the same way that Barnum did, I can be a bit provocative here by using this word humbug and saying, we argue about, is advertising science? Well, up to a point. Is advertising art? Well, that doesn't quite sound right either, because art sounds far too grand. But maybe advertising is best thought of as humbug, in the sense that Barnum used it. there's a wonderful book called Fables of Abundance by Jackson Lears, who's a sort of sociologist, historical sociologist, who's written a wonderful book about advertising called Fables of Abundance. And his whole story here is about how this sort of original carnival world of Barnum, became disowned by the advertising business, and he totally backs up everything I've been saying from that point of view, and that he's not the only one. But so that was how I got it, and I have no regrets about choosing that, because I think it's passed into the language a bit, and probably, I think, shaken things up a bit, which was what my intention was.
Yeah, so Humbug, the book Humbug, Anatomy of Humbug, is not just about humbug though. It does actually cover a lot of the historical thinking around strategy in advertising as well, and sort of different modes of thinking about how advertising works. I think you map out 6 of them. There's salesmanship, seduction, salience, social connection, spin, and showbiz. So they all start with S. And showbiz is the one that's probably the most reflective of humbug.
That's right. And I
As
mean,
maybe, yeah,
I wouldn't sort of, I don't think anything I wrote in that book I don't really disagree with now, but I think my thinking sort of continued to build on that some of those strands now seem to me perhaps more important than others, although I think they are all important in their way. Um, but yeah, but I had to tell this story because it really seemed to me this story had never been told before. And I think at the time I produced the book, that was true. I mean, Paddy Barwise, who wrote a nice review of it, and he's professor of advertising at the London Business School, so he knew a bit about it. He said he'd never heard this story told before in quite such a clear way.
yeah,
And I think it was the whole area of things that people would not dare to talk about somehow, that, these contradictions, that, but the contradictions that were not acknowledged, so just surfaced all the time as continual arguments within agencies or between agencies and clients. So, you would so often in an agency, you'll be sitting around a table and client is saying, well, we've got to have these 3 product points in the ad, and the creatives are saying, no, you don't want any of that. You just want this picture of a purple elephant on a bicycle. And they're kind of talking about completely different things. And they're never going to resolve that or make any sense of that unless they realize that they're both talking about just completely different theories about how the advertising is supposed to work.
yeah.
And it's not necessarily that one is right and one is wrong, but, they're both techniques that you can use to try and achieve your goals. And it's a
Yeah.
question of which is more appropriate in the circumstances.
Yeah, what's funny, the analogy you use is that it's a 6-sided die, or you even use this analogy of a Rubik's Cube, that they're sort of interlinked with each other and they can have sort of different makeups. But on the one hand, it seems like you could, if you kind of go purely trust the creatives, that's a pretty high risk scenario, right? Like they might get it totally wrong, or choose the wrong celebrity endorsement or entertainer that just is a miss. And then on the other hand, if it's over engineered and overthinking, it's too sterile and it's just too bland. And then if it's a mix of both, there's also risk with that too. If it kind of strikes the wrong tone, or it feels like it's sort of a camel is a horse designed by a committee kind of thing. And it's funny, like how do you sort of think of these as fitting together? Okay, there's all these things exist. Now what do I do about that?
It's a subtle one, because I think to some extent, I mean, I came up with these six things, and as I said at the time, there could probably be more than 6 if you thought hard enough about it, but 6 gives you a nice sort of visual image that you can hold on to, which is always slightly dangerous because it makes you think there's some sort of objective reality here, which is more solid than it probably ought to be considered to being. But I mean, a number of these things are they do overlap quite a lot. So, in the Anatomy of Humbug, I talk a lot about the idea of seduction, because at the time that's, a notion of the debates at the time were largely around the notion of subconscious seduction versus rational persuasion. And that's still, I think, a valid and interesting way of thinking about it. But then there's also you can make it simpler than that and simply say it's about salience and, top of mindness and mental availability, which has now become a more dominant theory. And perhaps we're sort of tending to forget about the seduction theory as well. What do you do about it in practice? Well, that's complicated too, because, you say, should you just trust the creatives? Well, again, that depends, because it depends what the creatives are trying to do. And the other big issue, which I explore at much greater depth in Why Does the Peddler Sing, is that within the last few decades, I fear it's become increasingly the case that creative people in advertising agencies are no longer focused on producing stuff that pleases the public, but are producing stuff that pleases each other and which wins them, therefore, creative awards or appeals to some sort of higher order concept like purpose, which is controversial to say the least. And it, whenever it loses sight of we are trying to be popular and famous and please the public, there is danger that we are producing something that is irrelevant. So, I came from an advertising agency background where what pleased the public was central to what we did. And that was true in a very practical sense, because we continually did qualitative research amongst our target audiences. And every TV campaign that we did, we would research amongst focus groups of target audience in animatic format, which was as close to the finished film as we could get. And we learnt a tremendous amount from that. And what you learnt from that continually was it doesn't matter who likes it, whether the client loves it or the creative director loves it or what anybody in the agency or anywhere else thinks about it. The only thing that matters is you show it to a bunch of ordinary people. And if they all look blank and say, I don't understand what that's all about, then it's failed. And sometimes you can solve that by just changing things round a bit. And sometimes, frankly, it's best to just kind of say, okay, we're barking up the wrong tree, we'll do something else. But, unless what you're doing is anchored in trying to produce work that is genuinely popular. And this is why, again, the world of show business, the world of entertainment is such a good sort of parallel for advertising, because, on the whole, nobody pretends that it's a successful piece of entertainment if nobody likes it. It may only appeal to a small group of people. Some things are more popular than others. Some things appeal to a small group of, an elite middle-class group. Others are more popular. But on the whole, if you want to be Taylor Swift or you want to produce Friends or The Simpsons or a Pixar movie, there's not much messing about. Its success is measured by the number of people who enjoy it and want to be part of it. And that is part of what constitutes its fame, although the fame also is part of what constitutes the enjoyment. So those two things go together. And that's exactly the same thing with brands and with advertising and the marketing of brands, I think. So, the more any agency loses touch with that and sort of privileges, this is a great ad, even though none of the public are clever enough to appreciate it, that's pretty much of a nonsense in my book. And that's where I feel a lot of the problems have crept in.
So following up, you're talking about this idea of fame and popularity, and this is a big theme throughout Why Does the Peddler Sing? And you talk about some of the sort of behavioral science and scientific background to it. You've talked about Byron Sharp and the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, and they call this mental availability. Daniel Kahneman calls it the availability heuristic. Robert Cialdini, who I interviewed on this podcast, I think it was episode 7 or 8, he calls it social proof.
Yeah.
And then Jeremy Bullmore, he says, we value the famous far more highly than the little known. And it almost seems sort of obvious in a way, but also something that we don't like as at a marketing department. I never say like, let's just make our product famous in a way. We always try to say, oh, we'll generate this many leads and impressions and measurements and conversions. And we talk about other things and don't just simplify it to fame. And it strikes me, is that something that folks in marketing and advertising should be doing more often, is just saying, hey, let's simplify these complex theories and just have fame and popularity be our North Star.
Well, fame is hugely important. I mean, I think it is, as Jeremy said. I mean, Jeremy was one of the great role models in the advertising world, sadly no longer with us. But, whatever I've said, I've usually find that Jeremy said it 20 years earlier than I did, and in far fewer words. But he did say that thing about all that brands have in common is a kind of fame. And I use that in the book because I think he's absolutely right. But apart from that, it's actually quite rare to find people in advertising talking about fame. I mean, I've looked at all my advertising textbooks and I looked up fame in the index. You don't see the word fame. And I think it's, again, a bit like Barnum. It's a slightly suspect word. It's a bit cheap. It's a bit vulgar.
Yeah.
What is interesting to me, one point I'd like to sort of just stress while we're on this is, I think mental availability and fame are concepts that go very closely together, but there's a crucial difference between them, because mental availability, as Byron Sharp defines it, I think is a useful concept, but essentially it's talking about something that goes on in an individual's head. It's a psychological concept. You measure it by saying my mental it's what is top of mind in my mind. Whereas fame, I think, is primarily actually a social concept. It's what's happening in society at large. Now, part of that is everybody will have a lot more mental availability because this thing is famous. But part of but what keeps it there is the fact that we are sharing it. It's a socially constructed thing. We have common knowledge. Not just that I know about this, and you know about this, but I know that you know about this. That's common knowledge. That's really important. And also that we, in all sorts of ways, we are jointly involved in engaging with this. So we'll talk about this. We'll argue about this. Controversy is good. Barnum knew that. We might be wearing this. We'll have the logo on our T-shirt. We'll have the Apple logo on the back of our MacBook, so that when we're sitting in the coffee shop, everyone can see that it's that. We've got the white earphones, which everybody still knows, that's who makes them. I mean, all these things are really important. They're the social aspect of what creates fame. And that, for me, is what makes fame as a concept sort of substantially different. And again, if you look back at the whole history of the sort of practitioner theories of advertising, I think overwhelmingly, from about 1900 onward, they have tended to be based around an assumption that it is a one-to-one communication, that here is the advertiser who is communicating with the prospect, who is reading the ad or listening to the ad, and then is being asked, do you remember the ad? And it's all one-to-one. And actually, successful advertising campaigns do so much more than that. They don't just work on a one-to-one basis, even if they're working on one-to-one with millions of people. They are producing things like catchphrases which pass into the language, got milk, whatever. I mean, catchphrases like that pass into the language, and they become shared, and so they take on a life of their own. And that is so much what I think advertising should be focusing on, is not just how do we influence one person, but how do we influence people en masse?
Something I'm thinking about also is that there's thinking about how do we influence people en masse, but if I was to like apply this to myself in this podcast or something like that, right? I don't want to be famous. I don't want to be Taylor Swift. A marketing history podcast would never be like the top number one on Spotify. And also it seems kind of miserable to like, like the people who try to like be at the top of those things, they sort of game it. It's very like, you kind of mentioned how it can be kind of crass to be famous. It's you have these like very silly YouTube thumbnails, and you have short things. You're kind of saying provocative things that don't always make sense. And I'd much rather though like just have respect among my peer group and think, oh, that person, he speaks to intelligent people. He asks smart questions. I learned something from that. And it seems like there's a lot of brands that might feel the same way about their products.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I guess so. But and I personally, I'm very sympathetic to what you've just said. I mean, I only want a very limited amount of fame myself. It seems to me that to be a genuinely famous person and carry it off sustainably over a long period of time requires some fairly some fairly heroic qualities of endurance and courage, um, or possibly some sort of borderline psychopathic tendencies. And you can think of examples for yourself. But I think there is a difference between a brand and a person. As a person, that's your life. If you want to be a famous, globally famous person, that has probably huge rewards and excitement if you're that way inclined. And it has huge sort of drawbacks as well, potentially. And not everyone can handle it. And a lot of people, burn out and have, terrible experiences as a result of it. But a brand is not a person. I mean, brands in many ways are like people. They are in many ways like celebrities. But the crucial difference is Coca-Cola is not a person. Even Tesla is not Elon Musk, although that's getting a bit too close for comfort. But, the two are technically different. And it's only sort of bad management that would enable one to drag down the other. But a brand is something that exists independently of that. So if you are managing a brand for commercial gain, then on the whole, the more demand, the more fame you can create, the better. Yes, I mean, you might not want to be a worldwide brand. You might be happy to be running a coffee shop with one branch that happens to be the most successful coffee shop in Frome, and you might not be ambitious to do anything more than that. But even so, that within that limited scope, probably fame is of some benefit. But I think it's brands at that level of the coffee shop with three branches is not on the whole what sort of our conversations about advertising and marketing are about, because that's not where the numbers are. We are talking on the whole about brands where bigness is better. It is a numbers game. It is about scale. Coca-Cola is a better brand than Pepsi because it's bigger than Pepsi. And these are sort of truths that tend to get forgotten. I mean, the late Andrew Ehrenberg used to have a wonderful way of saying, if your brand is so strong, why isn't it bigger? Which people never could kind of come up with very good answers.
Hard to argue with that one. Yeah.
So it's about numbers, fame, and,
Yeah.
on the whole, a £3 billion brand is better than a £300,000 brand.
Speaking about brand popularity and if your brand is so strong, why isn't it bigger? You write a bit about the 1990s when brand equity became a buzzword. And I've actually interviewed David Ocker. In fact, I've now recorded 2 interviews with David Ocker, who's probably the individual who's most responsible for popularizing the idea of brand equity. I don't think he actually invented it, but he definitely wrote several popular books about it and has continued to champion brand equity. And then you wrote a book on brand equity called What is Brand Equity Anyway? I haven't read this one yet.
I would say it's not nearly as entertaining as the other two. It's a much more sort of serious work, but it's also it's a critical work because that book it's a collection of essays or papers that were published separately, and I just kind of assembled them.
Uh-huh.
Um, but the paper that it's named after, What is Brand Equity Anyway? I wrote in about 1996.
Hmm.
So that was kind of in the wake of, and I mean, it is very precisely around 1991, 92. Um, Arca wrote Managing Brand Equity in 91, which so he was very much, he must have bashed it out pretty quickly to hit that trend. So he was very
Mm.
successful from that
I've
point of view.
I've looked at
Then,
it. I think that like when you look at where he publishes books, and you can use like an engram lookup of brand equity as a term. It is basically, I think he saw it at a conference or was at a conference in '89 or so about it. Wrote
yeah,
academic papers on it, and then published
yeah.
managing brand equity, or
I
was
think
it building
you
brand
can
equity?
date it
Is one of
fairly
those.
precisely. There was a
Yeah,
Marketing Sciences Institute conference in 1988, which I think
that's right.
put brand equity on the map. And
Yeah,
it hadn't really been in existence until the mid-80s, I would say, at the earliest. You know, this was all on the wake of various controversies about mergers and acquisitions and how
right.
accountants dealt with this concept of goodwill and so forth. And it kind of grew out of that. My take on it was critical to the extent that although everybody talked about brand equity, it seemed to me that it meant a number of different things, and I was never quite sure which one it was meant to mean. You know, was it actually the value of a brand, the financial value of a brand? And if so, how do you arrive at that? That's a whole area of controversy in itself. Or is it about some concept of brand strength? Coming back to our Ehrenberg quote, you know, how do you measure that? And if your brand is so strong, why isn't it bigger? But there are ways you can measure it, but they're all different. Or is brand equity actually about something more descriptive? Is your brand equity to do with what you stand for, or is it to do with your distinctive assets? I mean, there are all these different concepts which are sort of vaguely thrown in together. And a lot of people were trying, including me at the time, I've got to say, but a lot of people were trying to sort of make sense of them by just kind of rolling them into a ball and sticking them all into a PowerPoint chart and adding some arrows or something and saying, look, that's brand equity. But actually, it didn't really solve those intellectual problems. It was just totally fudging the issues. And I think we hear a lot less about brand equity now. I mean, it was the sort of buzzword of the 90s, and it's rather faded from view. And a lot of those issues, I think, are of less interest to people now, but that they have some interest.
What is interesting though is that when brand equity emerges, it did seem to shift the conversation about brand and branding in general. And I think it has now more,
Yes.
from what I can tell. And I was born in 1990, so I wasn't alive for many things before this, but it seems like brand was not really as much of a strategic term as it was after brand equity. And now brand equity, a lot of the ideas of that are just kind of rolled into brand and it's brand image, brand positioning. And
I think you're right. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the positive thing about that whole brand equity sort of mania is that it did refocus people on there really is a value in
Mhm.
brand names. And there's a way of thinking about brands which is greater than just, you know, the short term sales issue. And that was not totally original because that quote, it was so well put. It's never been better put than by that quote from the chairman of Quaker Oats, which I actually managed to trace back, was actually probably said over a lunch back in the 1930s. You know, that if this business were to be broken up and I was to take the trademarks and goodwill and you were to take the factory and all the stock, you know, I would do better than you. And that's a sort of, that puts it so clearly that that's what brands are all about.
This was John Stewart of Quaker Oats.
John Stewart was his name. That's right.
Yeah, it's such a great quote. That sounds a lot like brand equity, right? It sounds like the value of a brand. And here it is in the 30s that you traced it to.
It just waited another 50 years for somebody to come up with the expression brand equity. But I think what I find less positive about it in terms of its legacy is that it left everyone with this idea that a brand was something sort of somehow mystical, and every brand has an essence, and every brand is based around a big single idea, or more recently, and even more, I think, contentiously, every brand is built around its purpose, and all this stuff about Jim Stengel and the power of why and all this stuff, which, I don't really want to get into now because we haven't got time, but other people have taken that apart much more eloquently than I probably could. But I do think that is, on the whole, completely missing the point. And again, in Why Does the Peddler Sing, I try to spell out what I think brands really are all about. They do not grow out of some mysterious essence or single idea. They grow over time out of their gestures and their responses to what happens to those gestures. And, by building on, again, Jeremy Bullmore probably said it better than I did many years previously, said something about, brands are built the way birds build their nests, out of sort of bringing lots of twigs together. And that's, if you want a metaphor, it's more like that. They are accumulated over time, but what is essential for them is really just the energy and a certain degree of consistency, but mainly consistency around very tangible things like distinctive assets and logos and characters or whatever, and names. So it's much less mystical, and it's much more concrete than the general discourse, I think, usually allows for.
As we move towards wrapping up, I want to kind of come back to an idea you were bringing up earlier. The crux is this idea of humbug or showmanship. And then there's all the marketing and advertising literature of building strategies, of doing measurement, of salesmanship, seduction, salience, social connection. And an idea that I have, or that I'm thinking about, is that if you want to follow any formula, for lack of a better word, of how to, win a client and come up with a campaign or market a product, if you follow all of that, you can probably be relatively mediocre or maybe even slightly above average if you kind of just follow the stuff to a T in a formulaic way. But if you want to have like a truly great campaign, a Barclay card style campaign, a campaign that's really memorable, there's just some certain quality to it that might be showmanship or some level of creativity. That's just not something that fits neatly into any formula. That there's some element of the unexpected to it. There's some element of luck, some element of sort of the cultural zeitgeist that is probably not going to ever be captured into one model. And that to like have a great campaign, there's just some level of happenstance to it that's really hard to quantify or put into some framework in advance.
Yes, up to a point, but I'd sort of just qualify it slightly. I think there always is an element of luck or happenstance, but that doesn't really get you very far, and it's not really what anybody wants to hear. It's just the truth. The more practical question is, what can you do to sort of maximize your chances of getting lucky, if you like.
Right.
And again, there is no simple formula, because we are in the whole realm of aesthetics, which is another word that nobody wants to use or confront, if you like. But again, I just going to say, if you think of making a great ad campaign is the same kind of challenge as making a successful Pixar movie. I mean, one of the best books about creativity from that point of view is Ed Catmull's book about how they do it at Pixar.
Yeah. Creativity Inc. It's one of my favorites.
And you realize when you read that, it is not like they all sit around and go, hey, let's do a film about toys. That's the big idea. And suddenly it's all there. I mean, that's not important at all. What actually makes the difference is just a fantastic amount of grunt work that puts together how every detail of this product fits together into a whole that is aesthetically successful. And in their case, that means, the characters, the dialogue, the drawing, the visualization, the songs, everything. And an army of people are involved. On that level, this is a much more complicated thing than even the most complicated 60-second advert, let's face it. But what it requires to produce quality is an ability to focus on how that's going to work and work together to achieve that. And another thing you notice in the account, Catmull's account of how they work at Pixar, is, they do not, on the whole, sort of say it has to be like this because, or, well, if it's not going to be like that, I'm not working on it, so I'm going to go. People don't engage in fight or flight. They are going to have to engage potentially in conflict. It may be a lot of discomfort, but their protocols that they try to stick to are you stay in the room and you'll try to be honest with each other and you try to advocate what you believe is right, but also continue to listen to what the other people are saying and stay in the room until you come to some resolution that you all feel happy with. And if ad agencies and their clients were better at doing that collectively, they would have a better quality of output. And that's really all it comes down to. That's I think, the crucial factor. So I think that again, there are huge lessons to be learnt from the sort of parallel processes that are going on in the entertainment field. And that's as close to a formula for it as you're going to get.
That's right. Yeah. I love that book, Creativity Inc. By Ed Catmull. I actually, prior to being a marketer, I did filmmaking, and I think what that was written, I think it was published around 2010, 2011. And Pixar was, I think for me, Pixar was at its peak right then.
Yeah.
And if you think of their movies that they just released, they'd released Ratatouille, about a rat in Paris, Wall-E, which had started, the first 20 minutes is almost a silent film of a robot that's alone. And then they released Up, about an 80-something-year-old man. Again, and if you thought of like focus group testing those, you wouldn't think like a rat in Paris, a silent film starring a robot, and a man about or a movie about an octogenarian who's grumpy, that those would test well and be big box office hits. And yet some creative something, their process, they were able to create both art, but it is also very popular.
That's the key thing. It's art, but it's popular. And I think, the agency that I used to work for, at its best, that was exactly what we did. And we weren't the only ones. I mean, there were other agencies who worked different ways who also achieved that. Collett, Dickens and Pearce and DDB at the best and so forth. It can be done.
Yeah. Well, cool. As I'm wrapping up here, I didn't mean to plug somebody else's book, Creativity Inc.
Oh, I'm very happy to plug that one, but
I also wanted to plug Anatomy of Humbug and Why Does the Peddler Sing?
This is the one I guess I'm still more excited about, but
yeah,
I like both.
It's great. I like them both. It was actually great to just read. I read them almost as one book, just kind of as soon as I closed the cover of Humbug, I went right on to Peddler, and I think they flowed together really well. So anyway, so listeners, if you like this podcast, definitely check those out. They're fun reads, highly recommended. And so Paul, really enjoyed this conversation. Aside from those two books, are there any other places you'd point listeners to if they wanted to read your work or find you online?
those two books is probably the best of me as far as all this is concerned. You can, I mean, if you're real nerds, can find other bits of video online, but stick to those books and you'll get most of it.
I'll also plug, I'll drop a link to your, I think it was a TEDx talk that you gave.
Actually, that is a good one. And although that's 15 years old, I still think that is a good TEDx talk.
Yeah. And you bring up the idea of aesthetics, which you very briefly mentioned on here, but that's another interesting topic.
Yeah, that's the one area I would explore further if I were to write another book.
Well, I hope you do. Paul Feldwick, thanks so much for joining me. I've had a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.
A History of Marketing is researched and edited by me, Andrew Mitrak. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blogs about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. This podcast is a passion project of mine, and I have zero interest in monetizing it. But if you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app. Or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.